I am Hazel Baker, founder of LondonGuidedWalks.co.uk and your guide to London's eclectic history. Today's episode is about White Conduit House. As usual, show notes, audio and video versions are all available completely free at londonguidedwalks.co.uk/podcast. And if you like what we do, then please write a review. So, get that cup of tea ready. Let's begin. Today we're stepping off the beaten track to explore one of London's most fascinating lost landmarks, a place that was once a thriving leisure destination, a birthplace of organised cricket and a window into how ordinary Londoners spent their free time 2 centuries ago. We'll meet the Londoners who lived, played, worked and rioted there and map exactly how this place fell. White Conduit House stood on an area of Islington called Barnsbury, a venue so popular, so influential in its day, that it shaped the very sport we associate most with British culture. Yet, today, almost nothing remains. A restaurant façade on Barnsbury Road carries its name. A few community gardens preserve fragments of its grounds. And that is it. But the story of White Conduit House, well, that's absolutely worth telling, because it's not just about the building. It's about the birth of leisure culture in London, about the classes who used it and why, about music and cricket and innovation, and ultimately about how a city devours its own history. To understand White Conduit House, we need to go back, way back, to 1431. London's growing population desperately needs fresh water. Disease is rampant. Water sources in the city are filthy. The remedy? Engineering, innovation, and crucially, infrastructure built outside the city's walls. In 1431, under a royal licence from Henry VI, remember this was during the 100 Years' War when English fortunes were crumbling, 2 people named John Ferriby and Marjorie Ferriby received permission to construct something rather remarkable, a water conduit. A long pipe system that would bring spring water from the meadows of Barnsbury north of the city all the way down to the Carthusian monastery of Charterhouse in Clerkenwell. Think about the engineering. Water doesn't flow uphill, but Islington sits higher than Clerkenwell, and these medieval engineers understood gravity. They understood elevation. They planned an entire system where water would flow downhill through lead pipes, lead, which was expensive and precious, for literally miles. That was to supply drinking water to the monks and communities. The terminus of the system, the head of the conduit where the water first arrived in a cistern, was enclosed in a small building. And this building was faced with white stone. White Conduit. Just like that, infrastructure got a name, a distinctive, memorable name, and names, as we'll see, have staying power. For 2 centuries, the conduit worked. Water flowed, monks drank. The system became so established in local identity that the area around it began to be called by the conduit's name. Streets, places, landmarks, they inherited the identity of that small white stone building. But by the 17th century, something happened. The new river was built. It was an ambitious engineering project by Hugh Middleton that brought water from Hertfordshire to London. Suddenly, the old medieval conduit was redundant. The monks at Charterhouse switched to the new river. Well, why use the old system when they had a better, more reliable source? So the conduit fell out of use, but the building remained. And here's where it gets interesting for our story, because a redundant building in a pleasant rural spot outside the city with good fresh air was about to become very valuable for an entirely different reason. Let's jump forward now to the late 1600s. And London is recovering from the Great Fire and the Plague. The city is prosperous again, and importantly, it's becoming crowded, dense, polluted by coal smoke and industry. And Londoners, working people, middle-class people, shopkeepers and clerks and tradespeople, they're all feeling something new, a need to escape, to breathe fresh air, to get away from the noise and smell and congestion of the city. Up until this point, that kind of recreation was expensive. You had to take a boat or travel far out and spend money on transport and accommodation. But the rural areas immediately north of London, in Islington, Highbury and Hornsey, these were becoming accessible. Close enough for a day trip. Green fields, fresh country air. And there, sitting on its own piece of land, was a building everybody knew as the White Conduit. An old, somewhat neglected building, no longer serving its original purpose, but perfect for repurposing. Starting in the late 17th century, the White Conduit site transformed into a pleasure destination, a tea garden, a place where Londoners could go for the afternoon or evening, sit in the open air, take refreshment and be entertained. Unlike the grand pleasure gardens of the era, and we're talking about places like Vauxhall and Ranelagh, these were expensive and fashionable and catered to aristocrats and the wealthy. White Conduit House was different. It was deliberately, proudly democratic. It welcomed working-class Londoners. It was affordable. You didn't need to be gentry to belong here. In fact, quite the opposite. One historian describes it as barely respectable, and that's meant fondly. It was the people's pleasure garden, and that's crucial to understanding why it became so beloved and why it survived so long. But here's what's interesting. Simply existing wasn't enough. In 1754, Robert Bartholomew took over White Conduit House. And if you want to understand the success of this place, the real turning point when it went from being a minor side road attraction to being genuinely famous across London, you need to understand Robert Bartholomew's vision and, honestly, his marketing genius. Because Bartholomew didn't just run a tea garden, he reinvented it. First, he invested in improvements. He created a long, elegant promenade. He built a beautiful circular fish pond, and fish ponds were not just functional, they were status symbols, symbols of aesthetic refinement. They showed that you cared about beauty, not just profit. He added arbours, shaded alcoves where people could sit, talk, flirt, and conduct business away from the sun and prying eyes. And crucially, and here's where Bartholomew shows real understanding of his clientele, he built a fence. 7 feet high. Why? Because the meadows and fields surrounding White Conduit House were still common land, still used by local people for farming, walking, travelling and loving. You could be disturbed by random farmers herding sheep, by labourers, by passing traffic. A 7-foot fence meant privacy, exclusivity even, for the paying customers. But the real genius was in the details. In August 1754, Bartholomew placed an advert in the Daily Advertiser, and listen to what he's promising. Hot loaves and butter every day, milk directly from the cows, coffee and tea and all manner of liquors in the greatest perfection. Also a handsome long room, from whence is the most copious prospect and airy situation any now in vogue. What's he selling? Freshness, purity. He's saying the milk comes directly from the cows. We even have that now, farm to table. No intermediaries, no adulteration. The loaves are hot, baked, fresh, not left sitting. And the views? Oh, wonderful views, the most airy situation. This is marketing that speaks to real anxieties. Urban Londoners at this time worried about food quality. Adulteration was rampant, milk was watered down, bread was padded with chalk, butter was mixed with tallow fat. And here comes Bartholomew promising authentic, pure, fresh food. And it worked. Those hot loaves and butter became legendary, so famous that they became what's called a street cry, something sung by vendors throughout London. Old ladies, according to contemporary accounts, would specifically request white conduit loaves for their tea tables, viewing them as a luxury item. And here's a tragic postscript to Bartholomew's story, and it's one I think is worth telling, because it shows how fragile success could be in Georgian London. After leaving White Conduit House, Bartholomew, who had been worth estimated £50,000, he also owned the Angel Inn at Islington, and he rented around £2,000 of property a year around Holloway and Islington. And he was renowned for having the greatest quantity of haystacks of any grower near London. And it's the same man who fell victim to the mania of lottery insuring. He was paying £1,000 a day on lottery speculation. It utterly destroyed him. For the last 13 years of his life, he subsisted on the charity of those who had known him in better days. He died in a garret in Angel Court, Windmill Street, aged 68, a man of gentlemanly manners and a cultivated mind, reduced to nothing but gambling. It's a sobering reminder. The man who made White Conduit House famous couldn't save himself. Now I want to bring in a literary angle because it shows how culturally significant White Conduit House had become. And in the late 1760s, Oliver Goldsmith, yes, the same Irish writer, poet, playwright and journalist who wrote The Vicar of Wakefield and She Stoops to Conquer, was living in London, moving in literary circles, and was observing London society with a satirist's eye. In 1762, Goldsmith published a series of essays under the pseudonym James Willington, supposedly written by a Chinese philosopher visiting London. The collection was called The Citizen of the World, and it was brilliant. It allowed Goldsmith to comment on English society through the eyes of an outsider, finding it both fascinating and rather ridiculous. In one of these letters, letter 112 if you're curious, Goldsmith writes about the leisure habits of Londoners, and he specifically mentions White Conduit House. He describes how the inhabitants of London often assemble to celebrate a feast of hot rolls and butter at this venue. What's remarkable is that Goldsmith isn't just mentioning it in passing, he's using it as a cultural touchstone. A place so known, so culturally embedded, that he can reference it in a literary work intended for an educated audience and expect them to immediately understand the reference. This tells you something important. By the 1760s, White Conduit House wasn't just a venue for low-class leisure. It was known, discussed, referenced in serious literature. It had entered London's cultural consciousness. And here's what's really interesting to me as a historian. Goldsmith is being slightly satirical. He's amused by these ordinary people going out for hot rolls and butter, treating it as if it's a significant social occasion. But there's no contempt in his satire. There's actual affection. He recognises that these people, clerks, shopkeepers, servants, apprentices, they're seeking a moment of gentility. They're taking an afternoon off. They're spending a bit of money on themselves. They're enjoying life. And that matters. Now, painting White Conduit House as a democratic working-class venue, and yes, that's true, but I want to complicate that picture a bit because Bartholomew was clever about adding cultural prestige to the place. In the long room, that handsome room with the most copious prospect, there was an organ. And starting in 1764, there was a resident organist to play it daily for the entertainment of patrons. His name was James Hook. James Hook is an interesting character in Georgian musical history. He was born in 1746, so by 1764 he was only 18 years old, yet already talented enough and experienced enough to be hired as the resident musician at an important London venue. Hook came to London from Norwich, probably arriving around 1763 or 64, as a young man seeking to make his way in London's competitive music world. White Conduit House offered him steady employment, a platform, and crucially, access to an audience. Every day, patrons came to hear him play. Well, what would he have played? Well, likely a mix of popular songs, airs that people recognise and enjoy, interspersed with some more serious instrumental works. Music was part of the entertainment offer at White Conduit House, just like the food and the views and the social companionship. But here's what's significant. Hook's tenure at White Conduit House didn't last long. By 1768 he moved on to a more prestigious position at Marylebone Gardens, and then his career really took off. He became a celebrated composer, writing operas, songs, instrumental pieces, and he lived to be 81, a very long time for the 18th century, and he had an enormously productive career. But White Conduit House was where he started. It was his first significant London position. It was his platform for finding patrons and proving his talent. And that tells you something about the venue. It was a place where talent could be spotted, where young musicians could establish themselves, where ordinary people could hear professional music performed daily. And that's remarkable, actually, because that's a level of cultural access that speaks to the sophistication of the place. You could go to White Conduit House, eat your hot rolls and butter, walk in the long room with its excellent views, and listen to a talented young organist playing classical music. And you didn't need to be wealthy or aristocratic to do it. It's a form of cultural democracy that's quite moving, really. Now, we're shifting gears because the next chapter of White Conduit House's story takes us into something that would reshape British culture entirely. The story of how organised cricket was born. By the 1780s, cricket was being played in various places around England. It was a sport with possibly medieval origins, but it wasn't organised. It wasn't standardised. There were no consistent rules. Different regions played different versions. And then, in the 1780s, a remarkable thing happened in Islington. The fields adjacent to White Conduit House, they were called White Conduit Fields, became the site of organised cricket matches played by London's aristocracy. We're talking about some of the highest-ranking noble families in England. By 1782, the White Conduit Club was formally established. These were gentlemen, actual lords, dukes, earls, who wanted to play cricket against each other. The club had rules. It had a membership. By 1785 there were 144 members, and the rule was explicit. None but gentlemen ever to play. Yet, despite this gentleman-only rule, the club employed professional cricketers, players like William Silver Billy Beldam, Lumpy Stevens, and John Small Sr. These were the elite athletes of cricket, the professionals whose skill and talent the gentlemen wanted to play against and learn from. It was a fascinating collision of class hierarchies, aristocrats playing against professionals, yet maintaining the fiction that the professionals were servants or employees, not equals. But here's where the real drama comes in. White Conduit Fields wasn't a private ground. Yes, the fields immediately round the tea house were enclosed by Bartholomew's 7-foot fence, but the cricket ground proper was on open meadowland, and running across that meadowland, now the present-day Thornhill Road, was a public right-of-way. Picture the scene. You're an earl. You're playing cricket, taking it seriously, focusing on your game. Then a farmer comes by with a cart and ox and using the public footpath that crosses the cricket field. Pedestrians use it. It's a right-of-way. This becomes genuinely infuriating to the aristocratic players. They are used to privacy, exclusivity. They didn't want some common folk watching them. They didn't want their games interrupted by peasants using a public footpath. In June of 1785, this frustration boiled over into a complaint published in the Times newspaper. The lauding cricketers, as they were dismissively called, protested that their games were being disrupted, and this grievance, this aristocratic complaint about lack of privacy on a private field in Islington, was about to change the history of cricket forever. Because one man took that complaint seriously. A man who understood the problem. A man who would solve it in a way that would shape British sport for the next 250 years. And his name was Thomas Lord. Let me tell you about Thomas Lord, because his story is absolutely central to understanding White Conduit House's historical importance. Lord was a Yorkshireman who had come to Islington probably in around 1774, seeking opportunity. He was a wine merchant, and he was also involved with the White Conduit House establishment. He helped maintain the cricket ground, acted as a groundsman, moved in those circles. He was a man of enterprise, someone who saw an opportunity and could act on it. By the mid-1780s, as the aristocratic frustration about lack of privacy grew, the Earl of Winchelsea and the Duke of Richmond, two of the most powerful cricket patrons, had an idea. They wanted a private ground, a venue they could control, where they could play their matches without interruption or public intrusion. They approached Thomas Lord and essentially said, "We will guarantee you against financial loss. Find us a ground." I mean, think about it. You're a relatively modest wine merchant and groundsman. The most powerful aristocrats in England are asking you to solve their problem, and they're backing you financially. Lord found land. In 1786, he secured a lease on a field at Dorset Fields in Marylebone, still outside the built-up city, but in a location where he could control access. Crucially, there'd be no public right-of-way crossing this ground. On May 31st, 1787, the first match was played at Lord's new ground. What historians now call Lord's Old Ground or Dorset Square, and on July 30th, 1787, the White Conduit Club reconstituted itself as the Marylebone Cricket Club, the MCC, and played its first official fixture at the new venue. Ironically, their opponent? The White Conduit Club itself, the players who had remained at Islington. So the two organisations, the old and the new, played each other to mark the transition. Now, the MCC didn't invent cricket. Cricket was already being played, but the MCC formed by this move from Islington to Marylebone, driven by the demands of aristocratic patrons for a private venue. This became the body that codified cricket's laws, that standardised the rules that made cricket an organised sport rather than a casual one. And everything that followed, the spread of cricket throughout the British Empire, the development of county cricket, Test cricket, the entire institutional structure of world cricket, all of it flows from that moment when Thomas Lord found a private field in Marylebone to replace the disrupted public cricket at White Conduit Fields. So White Conduit House, and specifically White Conduit Fields, is literally the birthplace of organised cricket. The venue that, when it was proved inadequate, when the public kept crossing it, when the aristocrats demanded privacy, that inadequacy drove the innovation that created the institutional structures that govern cricket to this day. And that's remarkable. That's the kind of history causation that makes you sit back and think, a footpath? A public right-of-way crossing a cricket field. That small inconvenience changed British sport forever. One of the most extraordinary things about White Conduit Fields is that it's visually documented in a way that almost no other 18th century cricket ground is. We have paintings, several of them, engravings, visual records that show us what the ground actually looked like, who played there, and what the experience was. The most famous is by Robert Dighton, dated 1784, and he was a caricaturist and painter. You might know his work from satirical prints of Georgian society, but he also painted cricket scenes. And his painting of cricket at White Conduit House is remarkable because it's not a satire, it's a serious record. In the painting, looking north across the field, you can see the distinctive curved tea room building of White Conduit House in the distance. You can see the small white stone building, that same medieval conduit head from 1431, still standing, now 350 years old. You can see the cricket match in progress with players and spectators. You can see the landscape, fields, open sky, the sense of being outside the city. And if you look carefully in the background, you can see the Islington workhouse, another landmark that helps historians triangulate the exact location of the ground. And historians have used these paintings, combined with contemporary maps and other records, to establish that the cricket field was roughly located half a mile north of the original White Conduit House building, in the area now occupied by Thornhill Road and the streets around it. There's also a painting by Thomas Rowlandson from 1790, which shows a similar scene from a different angle. Rowlandson was a satirist and caricaturist as well, famous for his bawdy humour. But again, these paintings are documentary as much as they are satirical. They show us the reality of the place. No other place has 5 or more paintings showing cricket being played. This concentration of visual evidence tells you how significant White Conduit Fields was, how interesting it was to artists and the public, and how much it mattered in the consciousness of the time. And that means we can actually see White Conduit House and Fields. You can look at these paintings and have a visual sense of what standing there would have been like. That's a gift that we don't always have with historical sites. Now, before we move on to White Conduit House's decline, I want to pause and share some extraordinary glimpses of everyday life around the venue, because the newspaper archives in the early 1800s are absolutely teeming with stories that bring this place to life in ways that the formal history can never quite capture. The fields around White Conduit House were a kind of stage for London life, a space where all sorts of human drama played out. Take this from the Morning Advertiser in October 1806. A race was run yesterday in a field near White Conduit House between 2 gentlemen of the law. One of them was to run 50 yards with a corpulent tailor on his back, while the other ran 100. It was won by the latter and afforded ample diversion for the spectators. The lawyer and the 9th part of a man went off the ground crestfallen, to recover their spirits over the wine they had foolishly lost. Now, the 9th part of a man, well, that's a joke. It's a reference to the old saying that it takes 9 sailors to take a man. So the journalist is poking fun both at the lawyer and the very fat tailor. It's a wonderful little snapshot of Georgian humour and competitive spirit, these 2 learned men racing and settling a score, one with an obese tailor on his back. It sounds quite idiotic, but nevertheless, I'm sure it would have been rather amusing to watch. Now, not all the stories are so light-hearted. In October 1803, the Evening Mail reported that a pitched battle was fought in the field at the back of White Conduit House at Islington, which lasted for more than 20 minutes, when one of the party gave his antagonist an unfortunate blow on the temple, who soon after expired. The survivor's name was Samuel Goodman, a journeyman shoemaker who had killed Edward Tune of the same trade. He was taken to Newgate Prison and was tried. The verdict was manslaughter. And in March 1810, two journeyman printers fought a prize fight in a field near White Conduit House for 10 guineas, with nearly 500 spectators. It said that they fought for over an hour through 35 rounds before one man, so badly beaten about the head he could hardly see, and he yielded the contest. And the fields are also used for more official purposes. In February 1804, the Clerkenwell Loyal Volunteers, nearly 700 members, were inspected in the fields next to White Conduit House by Lieutenant Colonel Jenkins, and they performed manoeuvres for 4.5 hours. The Honourable Artillery Company took breakfast at White Conduit House afterwards. Then they had their own field day in the contiguous fields. There was also a spa well in the fields, one of Islington's chalybeate mineral springs, part of the same geological phenomenon that gave us Sadler's Wells and the Islington Spa. People would ride out to drink the waters, meet friends, enjoy the same rural setting. One court case from the period, Cant versus Kiln and Dixon, involved a man whose pony had wandered through a gate while he was drinking spa water, and the gatekeeper locked the animal in and demanded a shilling to release it. The pony was never returned, and the gatekeeper was found liable for £10 in damages. And then there are the darker stories. In April 1808, a German furrier named Montague was found dead near White Conduit House with his throat cut. The initial inquest suggested suicide, but the Morning Advertiser reported far more troubling details. That a handkerchief was crammed down his throat, blood traced some distance, a knife without a handle found 90 yards away by a dog walker, and a man dressed like a plumber seen in the neighbourhood with blood-stained trousers. These stories, comic, violent, mundane, mysterious, they paint a picture of the fields around White Conduit House as a genuine cross-section of London life. This wasn't just a tea garden, it was a backdrop for a whole community's existence. And White Conduit House itself served as a landmark to well-known advertisements used for directions. For particulars, inquire at Mr. Holden's Post Office, Penton Street, near White Conduit House. Anniversary dinners for local churches were held there. The trustees of St. James's Church in Clerkenwell dined there. It was woven into the fabric of Islington life. So we've reached the cricket pivot point, the moment when the aristocratic patrons and Thomas Lord moved away to Marylebone, establishing the MCC and leaving White Conduit House to continue without them. The venue didn't close, but it did change. For a time, White Conduit House continued as a popular tea garden and leisure venue, but London was changing rapidly. Urban development was creeping northward. The fields and open spaces that had made the location attractive were disappearing beneath streets, terraces and housing. By the early 19th century, the proprietors were clearly anxious. They sensed that the venue's traditional appeal, fresh country air, rural views, escape from the city, well, it was eroding. So they adapted. They added new attractions. A maze was installed, bowling greens, archery. By the 1820s, there was a bandstand and a stage. They began hosting performances by singers and musicians, including, according to records, a celebrated vocalist named Mrs. Bland, who gave what was noted as her final public singing performance at White Conduit House during this period. Around 1826, in a deliberate attempt to reposition the venue and compete with established pleasure gardens, the proprietor rebranded White Conduit House as New Minor Vauxhall. Minor because it was smaller and cheaper than the famous Vauxhall Gardens, but attempting to claim some of Vauxhall's prestige. This rebranding came with a more theatrical, circus-like entertainment programme. There were balloon ascents. Hot air balloons were a novelty and a draw. Fireworks, jugglers, fire eaters. It was entertainment designed to thrill and astonish. Interestingly, this seems to have worked for a little while, and there was a brief resurgence of popularity. But, as ever, it came at a cost. The tone changed. The venue became less about wholesome refreshment and more about spectacle. Contemporary observers noted that by 1833, White Conduit House was regarded as less respectable than formerly. The class of customer was changing. The atmosphere was shifting. And meanwhile, the real problem, the encroachment of urban development, was relentless and unstoppable. There's one small tragic detail from this period that stays with me, and that is in January 1815, the Star newspaper reported that a boy, aged 12, died by falling through the ice on the water known as the Great Wheel at White Conduit House. A child's death in a place built for pleasure. It reminds us that these venues were real places where real lives were lived and sometimes lost. In 1829, the original tavern building was demolished and replaced with a much larger, more modern structure. This was a tea garden no longer. It was a banqueting house designed to accommodate up to 2,000 diners with an enormous ballroom. It was an ambitious reconstruction, a last-ditch effort to compete with established pleasure gardens and adapt to changing entertainment tastes. But the timing was catastrophic. By the 1830s, White Conduit House was caught in the grip of forces it couldn't control. London's relentless northern expansion. The once pleasant rural views were gone. Housing was being built all around it, and there was a coal gas production facility nearby. Remember, London in the industrial age was polluted by these facilities. The fresh country air, which had been the original selling point in the 1750s, was now contaminated. One contemporary observer noted that the fumes from the gasworks had effectively destroyed the amenity. You couldn't go to White Conduit House for fresh air anymore because, well, the air wasn't fresh. It was polluted by industrial manufacturing. So, here was this grand banqueting house built to accommodate thousands, sitting in a location that was no longer attractive, surrounded by urban development competing with established venues in better locations. By the 1840s, it was clearly dying. And then finally, January 22nd, 1849, according to the historical record, a farewell ball was held, a benefit ball for the check takers, the staff who worked the door. It was a goodbye, a last celebration before the end. 3 days later, demolition began. The building was levelled for a new line of streets. Those streets, including what became White Conduit Street, Tolpuddle Street and the terraces around Barnsbury, were Victorian speculative housing, cheap terraces for working-class Londoners. The pleasure garden, the tea house, the cricket field, the cultural venue, all of it was erased, paved over, built on. By 1849, a new Victorian tavern was constructed at what is the corner of Barnsbury Road and Dewey Road. It was built on or very near the original site of White Conduit House, and it was given the same name, White Conduit House Tavern. Later it became the Penny Farthing Pub, and now it's a restaurant called Little Georgia, serving Georgian cuisine in the evening. But the building, a Victorian-era structure, Grade 2 listed, still stands, and it still bears the inscription White Conduit House carved into its cornice. It's the last physical remnants of the original venue. You can imagine the Victorian proprietors, long after the original pleasure garden was gone, deliberately choosing to name their establishment after the famous old venue, trading on its historical reputation. But beyond that single building, there are green spaces scattered across Islington that are direct remnants of the original site. Culpeper Community Garden, just east of the Little Georgia restaurant, occupies land that was part of the formal pleasure gardens. It's now a lovely community-run garden, maintained by volunteers, with beds for vegetables and flowers. It's beautiful. A quiet green space in the middle of urban Islington. And when you stand there, you're standing where Londoners once walked through the formal gardens of White Conduit House, viewing the fashionable designs, enjoying the prospect. The garden was established in 1983 as a community project, and it evolved over decades. But it's also a continuity. It's a green space, a place of cultivation and beauty on the same spot where those things existed in the 18th century. Thornhill Road Gardens, about half a mile north of the Little Georgia building, occupies part of the actual White Conduit Fields cricket ground where the White Conduit Club played in the 1780s. When the fields were developed in the late 19th century, this portion was retained as a park, and you can walk through it today. You can actually walk across the ground where aristocratic cricketers played matches that would echo through history. There's a plaque there, donated by cricket historian James Dunnett, that marks the historical significance. It's small, easy to miss, but it's there. And Barnard Park, immediately adjacent to Thornhill Road Gardens, that's another green space that overlays the historical landscape. What strikes me every time I think about these sites is how fragmented they are. The original building is gone. The main site is now a restaurant. The cricket field is scattered across multiple parks and streets. The water conduit head, that distinctive medieval building, is long vanished. Yet the green spaces survive, the names survive, the memory survives. So let me bring all of this together, because we've covered a lot of ground, literally and figuratively. White Conduit House began as a medieval water pipe in 1431. 200 years it served monks in Clerkenwell. When that purpose ended, it was repurposed, transformed into a pleasure garden that served working-class Londoners seeking affordable recreation and fresh air. It became culturally significant enough to be referenced in literature, musically sophisticated enough to launch the career of a talented organist. Crucially, that his inadequacy led to the founding of the Marylebone Cricket Club and the entire institutional structure of world cricket. It was a space of democratic leisure, of cultural encounter, of social mixing across class lines. It was entrepreneurial, innovative, responsive to what people actually wanted. It was documented in paintings that show us exactly what it was like. And then it was consumed by urban growth. The thing that made it attractive, its rural location, was the thing that made it vulnerable to being built over. By 1849, less than a century after its peak, it was gone. Cricket historians know its significance, and anyone curious enough to walk Islington can trace the sites and imagine what was there. And for those of us interested in London, and I suspect you are since you're listening to this podcast, well, White Conduit House is a reminder that London is a palimpsest. Every street, every green space, every named place has history. You just have to know how to read the landscape. And if you ever find yourself in Islington, walking past Little Georgia on Barnsbury Road, or standing in Thornhill Road Gardens, or exploring Culpeper Community Garden, you'll be standing in places where history happened, where Londoners went to enjoy themselves, where cricketers played that would change sport forever. And that's worth knowing, and that's worth remembering. Thank you for joining me on the London History Podcast. I'm your host, Hazel Baker, and I thoroughly enjoyed taking you on this journey through the history of White Conduit House, from medieval water supply to Georgian pleasure garden to Victorian demolition. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review and share it with other London enthusiasts. You can find information about walking these sites, the historical paintings and maps, etc., all on our website, londonguidedwalks.co.uk/podcast, and then just search for the episode. You can also listen to episode 149, Milner Square, Through a Hole in the Wall, another episode about Islington. Until then, keep exploring. Keep asking questions about the places you pass, because London's history is all around you, waiting to be discovered. Until next time.